Welcome back to Silicon Bytes, and this episode of course has a contentious title. How on earth, you might wonder, is Russia closer to defeat Ukraine, closer to a comprehensive victory? Well, that's because they have stumbled across a strategy which they've already been trying to implement for I think the last 2 years, in fact. And under Biden they had their hands tied at various occasions, and now under Trump seemingly the same is happening. But that strategy is to hit Russian energy logistics, refineries, pipelines, and all sorts of infrastructure associated with energy. That is energy that is used for export to generate revenue for the Russian war machine, and that is also energy that is used to power the logistics of the invading Russian army. Before we jump into this episode, thank you to everybody who supports the channel, of course, especially those who support it through Patreon, buy me a coffee, all that kind of stuff. It's an immense assistance to help keep this content rolling day in, day out in the 4th year of Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine and assault upon European values, European territory, and democracy globally. Now let's jump into the episode. Russia's oil and gas industry, once a source of economic strength, an extraordinary economic and geopolitical weapon, has become a vulnerable spot, a real Achilles heel for the Russian economy and for Putin's war machine more specifically. Russia has a strategic problem. The main processing capabilities are concentrated in the western part of the country, while fuel consumption is rising in the Far East. Fuel logistics span thousands of kilometres, and now kilometre-long queues in Primorye are forming of consumers and businesses needing to purchase fuel. Large refineries from Kirishi to Volgograd are now within the reach of Ukrainian drones. Fuel trains are being filmed set alight by Ukrainian drones, such as the derailed Russian fuel train in Zaporizhzhia. Local media reported that Ukrainian drones struck a Russian fuel train in the Donetsk region, causing 9 of the train cars to catch fire. The drone footage was stunning and compulsive viewing. I highly recommend you look that up if you haven't seen it yet. The Flamingo missile, that's the new wonder weapon that Ukraine has been touting, threatens facilities previously considered out of reach. Putin has a real problem here. His elite are getting worried, and the concern is being mirrored in the US as well, nominally an ally of Ukraine. But the anger and anxiety of Trump are telling. Many in the US administration don't want to see Russia defeated. In that respect, China and the US are aligned on outcomes, and indeed the outcomes they don't want to see. It's grotesque, immoral, hypocritical, but all the evidence points towards this inconvenient truth. This episode starts with an interesting and actually excellent analysis translated from a post from the Russian Telegram channel Nizyagor about the current state of Russian refineries and fuel market. It makes for interesting watching or reading. Even if part of it is true, it suggests that Ukraine's strategy of striking Russian oil refineries and energy logistics routes is working. It also suggests that despite the outrage and anger in certain quarters, including allies like the US, Ukraine should persist in this strategy until their chokehold on the Russian economy becomes such that there is a clamour to end the war, or otherwise the Russian economy be squeezed to the point of collapse. As we've said for some time, this is the only way that Ukraine will, 1, end the war, 2, regain its lost sovereign territories, and 3, command sufficient leverage over Russia to be able to demand an element of justice and restitution, as well as the return of the stolen children. None of these things can happen from a position of relative weakness. None of them can happen from a frozen conflict or in the circumstances that Russia feels it can still gain the upper hand on the battlefield. So the text from the Telegram channel reads, "Tensions in Russia's fuel market are rising. In Primorye, there are kilometre-long queues at gas stations, and wholesale prices for gasoline and diesel have hit record highs. Officially, the reasons are no longer hidden. Refineries are shutting down after Ukrainian strikes. During peak summer days, up to 14% of processing capacity was idle. In 2025, the tactics of Ukrainian strikes have changed. Previously, they were one-time hits. A unit would be damaged, the plant would reduce output but recover within a few weeks. Now attacks are carried out in series and repeated on the same facilities over and over again. Ryazan, Novokubichevsk, Syryzan, Volgograd, Hypocrisy refineries. This prevents the restoration of primary processing and hydrocracking, as well as catalytic cracking units. For example, after a series of attacks, Ryazan refinery, that represents 5% of Russia's capacity, has half of its processing halted, while Novokubichevsk refinery, that's 3% of the overall, has its primary processing damaged significantly. The largest refinery in southern Russia, Volgograd's Lukoil, as well as the Samara and Syzran refineries, have stopped receiving crude entirely. Ukraine is widely using drones with a range of 1,000 to 1,500 kilometers, such as the AQ-400 produced by Firepoint. These are capable of reaching the Volga region. Simultaneously, drones and maritime drones are targeting export terminals. Attacks on Volgograd and Novorossiysk have temporarily halted oil product shipments. Magyar reported hitting the Druzhba pipeline, which supplies oil from Russia to its historical homeland. The choice of refineries as targets is explained by their technological vulnerability. Modern Russian refineries were built using equipment from Shell, Achilles, UOP and Haldor Topsy. Hydrocracking, catalytic reforming, isomerization and Euro 5 component production after 2022, deliveries of equipment, software and catalysts ceased. Catalysts are consumables replaced every 1 to 3 years. Without Western supplies, Russia relies on old stock or Chinese analogues with inferior performance. Hydro processing reactors and compressors are manufactured in only a few countries, with delivery times up to a year. China can cover only part of the deficit: pumps, heat exchangers and simple catalysts. However, for complex processes, its technology lags, and replacing Western components with Chinese ones requires restructuring the entire refinery unit. As a result, every Ukrainian strike on hydrocracking or reforming unit leads to months of downtime. The map of Russian refineries reveals a key strategic problem. The main processing capacities are concentrated in the European part of the country, while fuel consumption is rising in the Far East. Fuel logistics chains to eastern regions span thousands of kilometers, creating additional costs and risks. Kilometre-long queues in Primorye are a direct consequence of this imbalance between Western production and Eastern consumption. Large refineries from Kirishi to Volgograd are within easy reach now of Ukrainian drones. The Flamingo missile, if its specifications are confirmed, can reach Russia's largest refinery in Omsk. As the range increases, facilities previously considered out of reach are now threatened, creating a scale problem for air defense. Protecting all refineries across the territory from Kaliningrad to the Far East is practically impossible. Consequently, Russia's oil and gas industry, once a source of economic strength, has become a spot of vulnerability. Fuel, fire, and the great oil hypocrisy. Ukraine's refinery campaign, Russia's shortages, and the discomfort of allies. What happens when a petrostate's pumps run dry, when a war machine that prides itself on bottomless fuel lines starts rationing gasoline by coupons and telling drivers to be patient until the end of the special military operation? Well, we're finally here, the point at which a largely apolitical and indifferent Russian population starts to feel the effects of the war. And we didn't get here by accident. Ukraine has spent July and August methodically downgrading and degrading Russia's oil infrastructure, with refineries on fire, pipelines disrupted, and fuel trains delayed. Russian drivers queuing for hours, Russian officials blaming tourists and their own citizens for the pumps running dry. Western leaders, well, they're scolding Ukraine, sometimes angrily, for daring to hit the very refineries that power the invasion. The level of hypocrisy is grotesque. Frankly, allies that urge Ukraine to hold off from striking the invader, from holding back, and allies that restrict the range and capabilities of weapons to Ukraine in response should just absolutely go and screw themselves at this point. Just get out of the way and let Ukraine fight back, or else drop the pretense that they are for Ukraine. To offer lip service to the idea of Ukraine's survival is no longer enough. Unless you are for victory, you are acting as an enemy of Ukraine, and you should be condemned as such. The refinery war is reshaping the battlefield, and it will continue to do so. This will continue to escalate as we head into the autumn and the winter. It will squeeze the Russian economy further, which is already under significant duress. And it also exposes a transcontinental hypocrisy about so-called stability and peace. Spoiler, Ukraine's strategy is working, which is exactly why some people want it to stop. Well, this is a view shared by the Moscow Times and the Atlantic Council. Let's start with a headline that would have sounded impossible 2 years ago. Parts of Russia are facing gasoline shortages. As Reuters put it on August 21st, several regions in Russia and parts of Ukraine it controls are reporting gasoline shortages after Kiev stepped up strikes on refineries. Russia even reimposed a gasoline export ban on July 28th to keep the fuel at home. Logistics bottlenecks and repairs deepened the crunch. That's not just Ukraine's propaganda, it's a widely reported and verified fact, according to Reuters in an article published on August 21st, 2025. Independent Russian news outlet the Moscow Times painted the picture from the Far East. 13% of Russia refining capacity has gone since early August. Drivers are facing 4.5-hour lines, and ration cards are starting to appear at the pumps. One driver captured the mood. The pumps are covered with out-of-order signs. There are massive queues for the rest. The Moscow Times, August 20th, 2025. The Atlantic Council's Ukraine alert ties it all together. Gasoline prices soaring to record highs as social media is filled with videos of queues in regions across Russia and in occupied parts of Ukraine. That's from the Atlantic Council, August 21st, 2025. Where is it hurting, though? Which regions are introducing rationing, and where is the official spin coming from? Well, the shortages are worse in the east. Reporting converges on the Primorye Krai in the Far East. Arseniev, Usyursk, Chugurevsky, and even Vladivostok, plus Zaporizhzhia Krai and annexed Crimea. Trains hauling fuel to Vladivostok are delayed up to 2 weeks. Meanwhile, local authorities wheel out the nothing to see here, this is just typical summer peak demand talking points. That was reported in the Moscow Times, August 20th, 2025. The pro-Ukraine United 24 site aggregated public data and quotes Russian officials pinning the blame on citizens. Of course, in Primorye Krai, the regional minister scolded residents for stockpiling fuel, urging them to act responsibly and ride out this short-term difficulty. Reuters confirmed that lines were stretching back kilometres in Primorye. Crimea's Kremlin-installed leader admits there is a problem and warns it could last for up to a month, and says it won't be fully resolved until the conflict ends, as if he knows when that's going to happen. Of course, he doesn't. Since early August, Ukraine has targeted Novokupichevsk, Syrzan, Ryazan and Volgograd, a Rosneft heavy list, amongst others. On August 24th, Kiev's general staff confirmed a strike on Syrzan, on the Syzran oil refinery and Samara region. Hits and detonations have been recorded in the area of the facility, with damage assessment ongoing. Syzran's design capacity, 8.5 million tonnes a year, about 3.08% of Russia's total. That was from Ukrinform, August 24th, 2025. That same night, Ukrainian forces hit the Ust-Luga gas processing export complex near St. Petersburg. Another reminder that coastal export nodes are a soft underbelly of Russia's economy, not a safe haven. That was described by the Kiev Independent. And zooming out, analysts put around 13% of Russia's refining capacity offline since early August, as we mentioned. That's not just a small nuisance to the regime, that's a serious structural dent to its exports and, of course, to its ability to supply fuel oil internally. This was reported in the Atlantic Council and the Moscow Times. As well as that, the pipeline artillery, the Druzhba pipeline to Hungary and Slovakia, was hit. The oil lifeline feeding Hungary and Slovakia, the EU's holdout countries on Russian crude, who have deliberately chosen not to sever their commercial dependencies on oil sold by the genocidal regime in the Kremlin. On August 22nd, The Guardian reported Ukraine hit a key pumping station at Urnesha in Russia's Bryansk region, knocking out supplies to both countries. Hungary and Slovakia wrote to Brussels, warning of a multi-day suspension. Their foreign ministers said the physical and geographical reality is that without this pipeline, the safe supply of our countries is simply not possible. Blah, 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 blah. Hungary's foreign minister fumed it was the third time in a short time. Meanwhile, Orban's party posted a note from Donald Trump scolding Ukraine. Politico captured the quote in full. "Victor, I do not like hearing this. I am very angry about it. Tell Slovakia, you're my great friend, Donald." That was reported in Politico, August 22nd, 2025. Trump prizes friendships with autocrats over the survival of democracies. This much is clear. And he should not only be called out for this grotesque bias, but his demands for Ukraine to stop should be ignored. Well, the markets blink, oil prices and export rerouting. So how did the markets react to these Ukrainian strikes? On August 25th, Reuters had Brent crude at $68.12 per barrel and WTI at $64.08, up modestly as traders weighed the potential geopolitical disruption from Ukrainian attacks and threats of more US sanctions if Moscow stonewalls the talks. That was reported in Reuters. Well, the former is likely. Ukraine is going to carry on with this strategy, I believe. The latter is far less certain. Taco from Trump is the more likely reaction. What is Russia's workaround? Well, the main one is to ship more crude oil instead of processing it at damaged refineries. Earlier in August, Reuters reported exports from Western ports rising by 200,000 barrels per day as Ryazan and Novokubichevsk units shut for repairs. Flooding the seaborne market cushions domestic shortages, but it really hammers the refining margins and it telegraphs extreme regime vulnerability. This approach also reduces profit margins and the total funds that are being channeled towards Putin's war machine. Well, this was described in Reuters, August 6th, 2025. Next, India's blood oil arbitrage. Who profits? Who pays? Well, let's talk about the middleman economy. India, especially Reliance Jamnagar's mega refinery, which made a fortune buying discounted Russian crude and exporting refined products, including to sanctioned countries. Al Jazeera distilled it with a stat that is shocking. Reliance's Russian crude imports have soared from 3% before the war in Ukraine to 50% now. That was reported in August 22nd in Al Jazeera. Korea data cited by Al Jazeera, $85.9 billion in refined oil products exported since February 2023. An estimated 42% of that exported to countries that are themselves sanctioned, with the US among the top destinations by volume in the rest. Washington's response? Well, they've announced a 25% tariff on India over the Russia trade, while pointedly not hitting the biggest buyer, China, with the same stick. It feels less strategic and more like punishment levelled at a specific country. One Indian analyst called the tariff a total sham, arguing that Washington is scared to call out China. That was reprinted in Al Jazeera, August 22nd. Well, so much for the US policy of deterring and confronting China. What we see is the biggest taco when it comes to China. The rhetoric is all about confrontation. The action lacks spine and balls. China steps in, keeping the war machine's heart beating and the blood pumping. When Indian demand dips, tariffs bite and discounts narrow. And then that's the point where China steps in. On August 19th, Reuters reported that Chinese refiners bought 15 cargoes of Russia's Urals oil for October-November period, deliveries as India paused their purchases. Quote, Chinese refineries have purchased 15 cargoes of Russian oil for October and November, delivery as Indian demand falls away. That was reported in Reuters. The implication is blunt. As long as Beijing keeps absorbing surplus Russian barrels, ESPO from Cosmino, Urals on Atlantic routes, Russia's and Putin's cash flow persists, even if the refinery side is bleeding. This is why striking refining and export nodes matter. You don't just reduce revenue, you interrupt conversion of crude into military useful fuel and force costly rerouting that tightens sanctions enforcement windows. That complicated analysis there is from Atlantic Council. China is literally fueling Russia's war machine, and every time Ukraine lights up another distillation column, the transaction costs for doing that go up and up. We're approaching the end. Allies in name only, when allies try to stop effective tactics. Well, back to that tone. After the Druzhba strikes, Trump wrote to Orban, "I'm very angry about it. Tell Slovakia that," reported in Politico. And behind the scenes, US policy has grown openly restrictive. The Wall Street Journal reported, and the Kyiv Independent amplified, that the Pentagon created a quiet review process giving Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth the final control over long-range strikes inside Russia using US missiles, an approval structure that has effectively blocked such strikes for months. This was reported in the Wall Street Journal via the Kyiv Independent on August 23rd to 24th. The Kyiv Independent summary: the process has prevented the use of Army tactical missile systems, ATACMS, against targets inside Russia since the late spring, per an unnamed official. And Kyiv's response? Well, it's built its own tools and strike capability, long-range capability, without coordination from the US. President Zelensky said exactly that on August 24th. Now Ukraine must keep going because it works. Let's sum up what this refinery campaign has already achieved. Capacity knocked out by 13% since early August, enough to trigger shortages and rationing far from the front. Price signals: record high wholesale gasoline on the SPIMEX exchange, drivers queuing, export bans reimposed, and operational friction. Fuel trains delayed, highway queues, regional finger pointing. We also have pipeline leverage, the Druzhba interruptions that hit the EU outliers, Hungary and Slovakia, that have not broken ties with Moscow. This is politically sensitive pressuring right where Moscow wants to keep business as usual. And then there's global price stability, modest upticks, not a super spike. Russia tries to pump more crude to compensate. At worst, there are temporary pricing bumps and some other risks. Now, Ukraine isn't targeting civilians, it's targeting the industrial arteries of an invading army. That's what you do when you take survival and victory seriously, when you seek justice and restitution. That's what you need to do when you want the tanks to stop rolling and the missiles to stop flying. The outrage from certain corners isn't about ethics, it's about inconvenience. We're back to the tone and implications that Ukrainians would know their place. And if they must fight, they should die quietly and not inconvenience the world. There is also the implication in all of this that amongst certain allies that Russia will win in the end, so what's the use of fighting? Such an attitude is based on ignorance and weakness, because as the noose tightens around Russia's oil economy, Russia's defeat draws nearer and faster. Countries that import sanctioned Russian crude, then export themselves to sanctioned countries, should face the full weight of international condemnation, as well as those European Kremlin-friendly countries that depend on Russian pipelines, and cling to the illusion that you can fund an aggressor's war budget and hypocritically talk about peace and security. Well, here's the call to action. Ignore the scolding and tantrums. Tell Trump to go fuck himself. Keep degrading the refineries, the export terminals, the pumping stations. Make each barrel cost Russia more to ship and ensure less profit is achieved from each. Force China and India to pay higher friction costs for the blood oil purchases, because the queues in Vladivostok are not just an economic story or a PR win, they're a strategic win. They hasten Russia's defeat and they mean the Ukraine campaign is working.